A reading from Root of Passion. Somewhere in South America, Margot wandered through the marketplace, past a gauntlet of vendors peddling everything from wicker baskets to fresh chickens. The haggling voices ranged from simple questioning to downright belligerence as the customers and sellers engaged in the inevitable tug of war, bartering that was the staple of commerce in this part of the world. Margot understood little, since she didn't speak Portuguese. She lingered at a sweet stand, breathing in the pleasant odor of cinnamon. She didn't buy anything, fearful of the lack of health and sanitation guidelines. She certainly didn't need a case of food poisoning. She ignored most of the wares and goods that surrounded her. She rarely purchased trinkets. However, when she did find something amazing, she snatched it up quickly and became the envy of her friends back home, who couldn't believe the bargains she found during her layovers. As a flight attendant for an international airline, she traveled the world and enjoyed visiting the exotic locales, but she seldom stayed in any place for more than a day or two. Regions blurred together, and while she would never mistake Europe for the Sudan, if asked later where she'd traveled that week, she'd simply respond, somewhere in South America, Rio de Janeiro, I think. Three of the other crew members had enticed her to join them as they explored a nearby village. At first, Margot had balked, hesitant to be sandwiched in a jeep between Connor the pilot and Jeanette the co-pilot. She was sleeping with both of them, but she was rather certain neither suspected the other was part of a romantic triangle. Her best friend Grace was appalled by her bed hopping, but she was who she was, always playing the odds if it served her purpose. She'd only found herself in a few tight situations, but she'd managed to avoid the vengeful girlfriends and boyfriends who would pour acid on her car or send her dead flowers. Her luck was certainly being tested on this trip. She was floored when she learned she'd be working the same flight with both of her current lovers. Fortunately, Connor, a stately man approaching 50, enjoyed a simple dinner and a romp in the sack, while Jeanette was a wild woman whose evenings didn't begin until 11. Margot could easily satisfy both of them, and her own fatigue was worth it. Ah, the stress of bisexuality. She stopped and looked around, realizing that she'd absently turned a corner and the raucous noise of the vendors was behind her. Her co-workers were nowhere in sight, and she was alone in a narrow alley, the buildings on both sides so close that shadows sheltered the cobblestones. All of the structures were decrepit, and Margot thought if she pressed her palm against the wooden frames, each building would fall into a heap like tumbling dominoes. Shabby windows stared at her, each pane covered with pictures or drawings, dark eyes preventing the sliver of sunlight to enter. Her morbid curiosity beckoned her to explore, and she glanced at each window that she passed. Some of the symbols she recognized, pentagrams, astrological signs, skulls and scythes, but most were mysterious and strange. All were black and white, filled with sharp angular lines. None conveyed warmth or friendliness. She passed a large window depicting the Grim Reaper standing over a skeleton, his scythe pressed against his victim's rib cage. She shivered and stepped backward, deciding to return to the main street and the comfort of the crowded marketplace. A rusty hinge moaned behind her, and she turned to see an emerald green door just slightly ajar. How did she miss that? She hadn't noticed any doors along the alley, but she'd been focused on the artwork in the windows, so she rationalized that her eyes had absently tripped past it. Naturally curious and not easily spooked, she opened the door slowly, and the scent of vanilla overwhelmed her. She smiled. It was exactly like her grandmother's kitchen when she was a child. Grandma was always baking, and every Sunday when Margot entered the old lady's house, happiness wrapped around her. It was probably the reason vanilla was her favorite scent as an adult. She navigated a short hallway into a room filled with dozens of shelves, each lined with rows of unique bottles, carafes, and vessels filled with colored liquid. It was a stark contrast to the dreariness of the alley, and she turned a full 360 degrees, gazing at the reds, blues, pinks, yellows, and oranges. For a moment, she had this odd feeling that she'd stumbled into a Saturday morning cartoon. She stepped toward a shelf and studied the beautiful containers that held the liquids. No two were alike, different heights, shapes, and designs. Her eyes were drawn to a carafe shaped like a swan filled with golden fluid. The color embellished the fine cuts in the glass, and she automatically picked it up without thinking. It was heavier than she thought, and she wondered if it was carved from lead crystal. Her fingers traced the beautiful form and brushed against a metal band affixed to the bottom. It was a label inscribed with the words, Potion of Grace. She suddenly felt as if she was being watched. She whirled around, the swan nearly slipping from her fingers. Please don't drop that. You could never replace it. She faced a goddess. At least that was the first word that came to her mind. The woman, probably no older than 24, wore a perfect smile that made Margot tingle all over. A white gauze dress clung to her curves, and Margot could see the outline of her firm breasts through the sheer material. Her eyes were dark, and her wavy black hair flowed over her shoulders. Welcome, the woman said softly in perfect English. Margot wondered if she was American, since there wasn't a trace of an accent in her voice, but her rich olive skin suggested she was a native. Hello, she said, replacing the swan carefully on the shelf. This is a remarkable store. What's in the bottles? Everything a person could want. Too paranoid to reach for the carafe again, she pointed at the swan. That one's labeled Potion of Grace. What does it mean? As the name implies, it helps those who are, shall we say, more likely to struggle with klutziness. She gazed at the bottle. That's why it's displayed in a swan, isn't it? Swans are very graceful. The woman nodded. Exactly. She gestured to a shelf dominated by tall, thin bottles. This section is reserved for self-esteem, improved confidence, candor, and humor. Margot raised an eyebrow. That little potion can help somebody be funnier? Really? The woman shrugged her shoulders. I've never had a complaint. If that's true, then I know about 1,000 comedians who would love this shop. Both of them laughed, and Margot's gaze settled on a shelf behind the exotic saleswoman, to a heart-shaped bottle filled with rich lavender liquid and 2 glass doves perched at the center. What's that one? Ah, that's the root of passion. The woman carefully lifted the bottle with both hands and placed it on the counter. She gently pulled at the doves, and Margot realized they acted as an incredibly beautiful stopper. She leaned closer, unable to believe what she was seeing. The contents were moving. She watched the lavender liquid swirl inside the bottle, and for a moment she could have sworn the deep red and cerulean blue separated and remixed. The root of passion pierces the heart and frees a person of his or her sexual inhibitions. Margot snorted. I certainly don't need that. The woman shook her head and touched Margot's hand, staring into her eyes. Then it wouldn't work. Besides, you cannot buy anything in this store for yourself. It would be a waste of money. Do you see the sign? She glanced up to a simple white paper that hung above the doorway. It read, For a gift. So people don't buy anything for themselves. No, only to give to others. How do you know? What if customers try to use it? I know that the powers of the potions are affected by the receiver's energy. You have been here. You have one kind of energy. The potions will not work for you. However, should you purchase one for a friend in need, he or she will feel the full effects. Margot contemplated the theory. She couldn't imagine how it would be any different if she was to drink a potion or give it to a friend. Perhaps Grace. Grace could certainly use the root of passion, she thought. But the possibility of Grace, a surgeon, imbibing anything not approved by the FDA was unthinkable. Ironically, Margot would have no hesitation about grabbing the bottle and swallowing a few mouthfuls. That realization confounded her. Where is your sense of caution, Margot? She thought. You're standing in a ramshackle store in a foreign country talking to a woman who says she has magic elixirs that can cure the individual ills of society. Are you nuts? How about throwing back a few ounces of bleach, too? Yet, Margot knew she wouldn't hesitate to drink, and she couldn't explain it. It just felt okay. You seem drawn to the root of passion, the woman concluded. Do you know anyone who might benefit from such a potion? My friend Grace, but I couldn't get her to drink it. She's a doctor. Ah, I see your predicament. But I imagine with the right level of persuasion, she could be enticed to try it. And, the woman added, shaking the beautiful bottle, the root itself has its own magnetic qualities. They both watched the beautiful lavender swirl in the bottle. It seemed to move clockwise, and the effect was hypnotic. Eventually, the liquid resettled, but Margot's eyes remained glued to the bottle. Do you see? The woman said. Yes, she nodded. I'd like to buy some. How much and for how long? $100 for one vial, and I will only sell you one potion. Are you sure you want this one? She glanced at the shelves, but her gaze quickly returned to the root of passion. She'd just have to persuade Grace to try it. It'll be okay, she thought. How much does she need to drink? Just a sip whenever she wants to heighten her sexual senses or free herself of her inhibitions. The woman went behind the counter and withdrew a small oak box. She undid the clasp, and Margot saw that the book was filled with sawdust, cushioning a vial. Once the liquid was transferred, she carefully replaced the vial in the box. She presented it to Margot and smiled beautifully. Your friend is very lucky to have you in her life. As she handed over 5 20s, she thought, she's either lucky or I'm a sucker for a gorgeous woman.